Good afternoon and warm welcome to the Global Investor Action and Initiatives Towards Net Zero session at the P4G Global Summit AIGCC C-Level Investor Event. My name is Minju Kim, the Policy Analyst of AIGCC. It is a great honor to be here amongst you today. The Asia Investor Group on Climate Change is proud to be partnering with the P4G Global Summit and hosting this event on behalf of our international partners in the investor agenda. We are founded in 2016 to help Asian investors navigate and act on the greatest challenge of our time, climate change. Now we have 56 members across 13 countries responsible for over 15 trillion US dollars in assets under management. We are particularly happy to have begun more actively working here in South Korea. If you have any questions about AIGCC's work or plans, please come find me during session or after this forum, and I'd be happy to assist. The panel sessions aim to help catalyze Asian investors to adopt climate change strategies into their portfolios and encourage them to participate in global investor initiatives that are already active in many other countries. This event brings huge international investors from Asia to participate in 2 panel sessions and an offline networking session. And this event will be live streamed on YouTube for everyone to join. The first panel will address the Asian launch of investor climate action plans for investors, global and regional investor progress on climate action, including net zero commitments. The second panel, Scaling Up Green Investment, how South Korea can catalyze net transition in Asia focuses on overcoming local and regional barriers to scaling up investments, catalyzing private sector capital via new investment vehicles and partnerships. The last networking session is for you to exchange opinions and talk freely to each other, sitting at different tables. Now it is time to start the event with the first speech. Moving right along, Ms. Rebecca Mikula-Wright, the Executive Director of AIGCC, will continue with opening remarks. Let's meet her in real time via Zoom.
Hi, Minju. Thanks so much for welcoming everyone in person. Just checking you can hear me okay. But great it's very exciting to have AIGCC host our first event in Korea today, and an in-person and virtual event as well. And especially with the P4G in this really important milestone event in the lead up to COP later on in November, later in the year. As Minju said, we've convened this event today on behalf of our global partners who we collaborate and coordinate with on investor initiatives on climate through the investor agenda. And today, I'm really delighted to announce that we are having the Asia launch of the Investor Climate Action Plans, which is a single and comprehensive framework that the investor agenda partner organizations have developed to assist investors with the implementation of climate risks and opportunities into their policies and portfolios. We have produced the Investor Climate Action Plans Expectations Ladder and a separate guidance document. These will provide investors with clear expectations for issuing and implementing comprehensive climate action plans, including steps investors can take to support the goal of net zero emissions economy by 2050 or sooner. The framework aims to help investors navigate the existing expectations that are out there and the initiatives on climate change at a global level. It is inclusive and unique in that it sets out the expectations for investors wherever they may be on their climate journey, whether you are starting out or have already been working on implementing climate into your portfolios for a while now. The Investor Climate Action Plans, or ICAPs, Expectations Ladder summarizes the key actions that investors can take right now to cover the 4 interlocking areas of investment, corporate engagement, policy advocacy, and investor disclosure. And of course, governance is a cross-cutting theme across all of these 4 areas. So investors can use the ICAP's expectation ladder in several ways, including assessing your current approach to managing climate risk and opportunity, publishing a standalone climate action plan, and embedding elements of the ICAPs into your climate change strategies and disclosures. And of course, communicating all of your activities around climate and your future plans to your stakeholders. We do have an accompanying ICAPS guidance document that was created to assist investors to interpret the ICAPS expectations ladder. And it helps investors to self-assess where they are on this ladder to understand the specific actions you can take to strengthen your approach and make further progress. So I encourage you all to visit the investoragenda.org website, download the materials, and AIGCC will be working with members and investors in the region to understand how you can start creating your own climate action plans in coming months. So I mentioned earlier the importance of the P4G event in the lead up to the United Nations climate talks later on in the year. And we've been working closely with the UN team to help raise the ambition and implementation from investors. So we've asked Nigel Topping from the COP26 team to provide an opening video ahead of our first panel today.
Thank you, Ms. Wright, for the opening remarks. We'll continue with a video clip by Mr. Nigel Topping, COP26 high-level climate action champion for UN climate talks. Please watch the video.
Hello. The high-level climate champions efforts are organised under 3 campaigns: the race to zero, the race to resilience, and what we had sometimes referred to as the race to trillions, but recently launched as the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ for short. We launched this with its chair, Mark Carney, who's the UN Special Envoy on Climate Finance and advisor to the UK Prime Minister, and the high-level champions coming together on the eve of President Biden's climate summit. And GFANZ represents the biggest ever pooling of net zero climate finance commitments aimed at ensuring alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement to get to net zero by 2050. The Alliance gathers up existing net zero private finance platforms, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which launched in September 2019, the Net Zero Asset Managers, which launched last year, and importantly, it brought the Net Zero Banking Alliance, 43 banks from 23 countries with assets of $28 trillion on their balance sheets came together on the day of the launch. All of those firms, and there's more joining every week, have committed to aligning their operational and attributable portfolio emissions with pathways to net zero by 2050 at the very latest, and with plans of what they're going to do in the short term, the next 5-10 years. GFANZ now covers over 160 companies with over $70 trillion worth of assets. And incredibly, I note that AIGCC's estimate that up to $37 trillion in new investment will be required to shift Asia's energy system towards a net zero by 2050 pathway. That's going to be a critical objective to unlock decarbonisation in the world's most vibrant and fastest growing economies. And in many ways, the success or otherwise of our global effort turn on the progress we make in Asia. Governments have begun to send much stronger signals than even a year ago that they see a safe climate future and energy security that comes with clean, home-growing power essential to their country's national interest and prosperity and to the health and livelihoods of their citizens. Net zero or climate neutrality commitments late last year from China, Japan, South Korea were a first step, but the pull on the private finance community to shift the trillions is becoming ever stronger as governments become more granular and specific about their plans and policies. For example, we're all awaiting the energy mix policy that will underpin Japan's significantly more ambitious NDC for 2030 and the new settings that will follow the expected update of Korea's target, including a much faster phase out of coal and an accelerated transition towards the green hydrogen economy. So these are very exciting times for innovators. I welcome and look forward to the discussions in this session on regional best practice, on aligning portfolios, and I hope that the lessons here will serve to generate new ideas and new horizons for decision makers managing the vast investment portfolios in Asia that might just set the trend for the upcoming decisive decade.
We heard the introduction of this event as well as the agenda behind the main sessions. Now I would like to invite our first panelist to begin our first session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minju. I think Nigel's video highlighted what is happening at the global level for all types of financial institutions. So today, I'm really delighted to moderate this first panel and welcome our participants that are generously joining us from Tokyo, Copenhagen, London, and Washington today to hear the global investor perspective on how they're implementing climate into their portfolios. So I'll just introduce our panelists. We have Jon Jonsen, the CEO of PKA, a Danish pension fund. Jon is also a board member of the European sister network to AIGCC, which is the AIGCC. We have Akira Sugano, who is the president and CEO of Asset Management One, also an AIGCC member. And we have Sandy Boss, global head of investment stewardship at BlackRock and a member of BlackRock's Global Executive Committee. And also BlackRock is an AIGCC member and I think a member of all of the global investor networks on climate change as well. And we also have the P4G Global Director, Ian De Cruz, also joining us today from Washington. So to kick off this panel, I think what amazes me with climate change at the moment is that week after week, there's sort of bigger and bigger news on climate, whether it's government level policy announcements from China, Japan, and Korea on net zero, as well as the EU and US, now covering about 2/3 of global trade and emissions with net zero targets and commitments. Last week, we saw climate litigation against an oil and gas company to reduce their emissions, as well as litigation against governments on their duty of care to future generations. And we also saw historic shareholder votes against oil and gas companies on climate issues. Corporates and investors have been stepping up their net zero ambitions and targets, including here in Asia, and wanted to congratulate the National Pension Scheme of Korea on their new decarbonisation plans that were announced just last Friday. All of this activity points towards a mainstreaming of action on climate from a variety of actors, which is very encouraging and gives us hope that the transition to net zero is possible. But these commitments and targets need to translate into action, and it needs to happen at a scale and a speed that we haven't experienced or acted on before. And it's this action that's needed now and in this decade if we're going to have a chance of reaching these net zero goals. So with this sort of in mind, I'm keen to hear from our panelists today to understand, what is the role of investors in accelerating the shift to net zero, and how are you implementing your commitments? So firstly, I'll go to Jon from PKA. It'd be great to hear from you as a European asset owner on your approach in this net zero transition. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for having this important event. It's really truly important that we're having events like this, because this is also part of changing the agenda. PKA is a pension fund with 335,000 members. We are located in Denmark, and we have Danish social and healthcare workers as our members. They are very focused on getting a good pension, but also doing good if possible. So it's a very, very value-based member base. So we did our first green investment more than 10 years ago, and we now have invested 10% of our asset base up to $5.5 billion. So of the $55 billion of our asset base, we have invested 10% now in green investments. We have wind farms and solar farms in Europe and in the US, and we're also now just beginning building a big battery storage plant in relationship to our California solar plants. It's equivalent to more than 13,000 Tesla cars, so it's quite a big battery plant. So this is back to what it's all about. It's about doing the investments and doing the change for real, not only just setting targets, but doing it. So the way we did it was we have been setting targets from the beginning, and then we have been allocated resources and joined with like-minded investors. And then, of course, we made the real investments. So just a few words on setting targets. So in the beginning, it was just making the first investment, because it is a difficult thing to do the first investments. And then further on, it was moving into solar, now into battery. And now our new target is by 2025, investing up to 15% or $8 billion in green investments. And by doing that, we are actually lifting our fair share of the Danish pension funds pledge to the Danish government of investing 50 billion by 2030, and we're doing it 5 years before time. Just a few points about allocating resources, because it is important. This is not something that is happening by itself. We have allocated from the beginning resources. We have set up a separate company together with like-minded. We have asked like-minded institutional investors to join us. And we have, of course, also invested a lot of energy in the work of AIGCC. We have worked around the PAII and also been part of the net zero investment framework and worked heavily in many of the working groups there and in the steering committees. Of course, that is more than we have to do the investments, but it's helping us to be at the forefront and knowing what's important and how to align our portfolios going forward. And I really, really urge everybody to join in also in the AIGCC's work to do that. And the result is that now we have a strong green portfolio with an attractive return and risk relationship. So this is not Conamora and doing something for the world only. It's also attractive investments. And it's also a stabilizer. So when we see downturns like we did in the spring of 2020 because of the dreadful COVID-19 epidemic, these type of investments tend to hold the value a lot better. And so it's a stabilizer to our portfolio and can ensure that we can keep paying out pensions to our members. So it's not only doing good, but it is also an important part of our risk mitigation of our portfolio. And I do agree, Rebecca, I'm also thrilled with the news from last week, where we really saw some really important, saw some really important news around engagement. I think we have to discuss that a little further in the panel. Engagement seems to be working. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jon, on the importance of collaboration in your local market, but also the greater investor collaboration that you mentioned. Sugano-san, over to you now. I'm keen to understand your approach to your commitment and implementation, and I note that you were one of the first Asian asset managers to join the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that from you and your approach. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much for inviting me to this quite important event. I would like to mention about the asset management industry, which Nigel mentioned briefly. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, a global initiative to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions for asset managers, was established in December 2019. And last year, December last year. And Asset Management One is the only Japanese asset manager to have joined the initiative as a founding member. When the initiative was launched last year, there were 30 asset managers worldwide. And in March and April this year, 57 new asset managers joined, bringing the total number of asset managers to 87, representing $37 trillion in AUM, or nearly 40% of the total global AUM. We were also selected as a member of the advisory group that advises the steering committee of Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. We are working closely with the initiative with the aim of communicating to the world what the Asian companies could contribute, including the high level of technology and various initiatives of Asian and Japanese companies toward net zero, including fuel conversion, CCUS, and the use of hydrogen. Next, I would like to introduce what Asset Management One, our company, is doing more specifically. As a commitment of Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, we will set an interim target for the percentage of assets that are aligned with the 1.5 degrees scenario in terms of asset under management in 2030. We are required to set this interim target by October 15 this year before the COP26. In defining this target, we would like to use a science-based approach. There are some methodologies endorsed by the initiative. For the moment, we are trying to determine the alignment of a portfolio, which is 530 billion US right now, to the 1.5 degrees scenario based on the Paris-aligned investment initiative Net Zero Investment Framework, which is long, a PAII, a Net Zero Investment Framework prepared by the AIGCC. As for our basic approach to this initiative, we believe that we should first focus on the areas where we have the greatest leverage. Considering our portfolio of exposure to the Japanese assets, which is more than 50%, and considering our positioning relative to other global asset managers like BlackRock, we are one of the asset managers with the most influence on Japanese companies, obviously. Therefore, we believe that we should start by focusing on Japanese companies. We will focus on engagement, not divestment, as a method of reaching out to companies. In order to achieve net zero society in 2050, not only specific companies, but also the entire corporate sector and society as a whole need to move toward net zero. In order to achieve this, I believe it is important to promote the transformation of corporate behavior through dialogue. Engagement with clients is also important for the success of this initiative. We believe that collaborating with more asset owners and individual investors is important. We will start by deepening our collaboration with universal owners, such as GPIF, and at the same time, we will encourage a wider range of customers to participate in this movement. Through these various initiatives, Asset Management One hopes to play a leading role in the global transition to a decarbonized society. Thank you, Rebecca. Back to you.
Thank you, Sugana-san. Really interesting to hear about your approach to the net zero commitment that you've made, and also the importance that you place on your engagement with companies, obviously in the Japanese context, but obviously also more broadly. I'm keen to bring Sandy in here and hear about BlackRock's approach to your leading practices and some of the initiatives that you've also committed to joining. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very nice to be here at this event. Really an impressive set of investors come together on this important issue. Look, at BlackRock, the money that we're managing on behalf of our clients, this is all about their long-term financial goals. As a primarily index manager, we are often invested in companies for decades, and we're very invested in the transition, ensuring that companies are able to manage the transition effectively. I should note that we absolutely agree with the firm focus on engagement. We actually have a 65-person stewardship team globally now. 20 of those people are in Asia. And our reason for having them is because we want to bring sector expertise, bring regional nuance, and be able to have those important discussions with investee companies. We obviously also, in my group, are responsible for proxy voting. Now, since January 2020, BlackRock has really intensified our focus on sustainability. This is very much about our investment convictions and our belief and value for our clients and helping them meet those long-term goals. Rebecca's already spoken about the context. We now have 2/3 of the world's governments committed to a net zero by 2050 transition. And I think importantly, we have now embedded that in our investment convictions. So we actually believe, central to our investment thesis, that there's a 25% difference in economic value on the planet over a 20-year period associated with a successful green transition as opposed to one that is less successful. And at this point, we also believe that asset prices and portfolio risks don't fully reflect how this will pan out. And we recognize that there is a tremendous wave of interest from clients, asset owners, other asset managers to see a tectonic shift in capital. So that's the context in which we operate. Like Asset Management One, we are a committed member of Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance. And this is a very important commitment that we've made to be a net zero company and to assist our clients in managing their transition to net zero by 2050. And there's really 3 prongs in that that I'll focus on. So first, as I've mentioned, an extensive program of engagement with carbon intensive companies. We've identified 1,000 carbon intensive companies that represent 90% of the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in our clients' portfolio. We are meeting with them, asking them to have a business plan for how they intend to reach net zero by 2050, or an alignment globally with that. We'd like to see short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets from those companies. Very importantly, we are taking a sector-specific and region-specific approach. We recognize not every company should be reaching net zero at exactly the same time. That's critically important. But in Asia, very importantly, the discussion that we're having is about the rapid acceleration of the context in which they're operating. Nigel Topping spoke about the recent commitments in China, Japan, and Korea. And we discussed with companies the importance of anticipating changes in those national commitments, being prepared, avoiding stranded asset risk. And obviously we're speaking to them not just about climate, but in these engagements, we're speaking to them about natural capital, human capital, and broader governance issues. So I've spoken about engagement. The second key thrust for us is really measuring and managing sustainability risk. So we've integrated ESG risk considerations now into all of our active strategies. That's a significant commitment. 2.7 trillion of active strategies now are ESG integrated. We've launched Aladdin Climate, which is a software that enables clients to measure and manage the climate risk in their portfolios. We've now also committed to disclosing the portion of our assets that are net zero aligned today and the expectation of where those will be in 2030, within the same time frame our Japanese colleague alluded to earlier before the COP this year. So this is a really significant measurement challenge, but it's a vital one because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And then just finally, I won't say much about it now, but we are thinking about an ESG product offering, the third branch of our commitment, which is to make sure that we meet the demand that we see on the part of clients. So far, we've heard from global clients that 18% of their investments today are in ESG-oriented strategies. Within 5 years, they tell us that should be 37%. So that's a very significant change. And we're hearing the same thing from prominent Asian investors as well, that they want to make this transition. So GPIF mentioned earlier, obviously on the forefront of ESG-oriented investing, for many years, a real leader in the region. Recently, we've seen Temasek, the sovereign Singapore Sovereign Fund, make a commitment with BlackRock to launch Decarbonization Partners, a significant new investment. And then clearly in Korea, the National Pension Scheme has been leading on sustainability for years. We really welcome their announcements on Friday around coal elimination, as well as on beginning to use screening against companies that have poor ESG records. So Rebecca, let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Really a very brief but really comprehensive look at how you're approaching this through BlackRock, which is great to hear about the actions that you're taking now and how you're enabling your clients with that short, medium and longer term view. So really appreciate that insight. So now we're just going to turn and to pivot slightly away from the investor perspective, but we'll definitely dive back into there shortly, and just bring Ian, the Global Director for P4G. It'd be great to hear from you, Ian, on what's been happening over the P4G Summit in the last few days, and some of the key commitments and announcements that have come out. And also, it'd be great to hear about, what P4G's role is in accelerating investment into the climate change space. Thanks very much, Ian.
Thank you, Rebecca, and your team at AIGCC for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here today. At P4G, we really accelerate the most cutting-edge solutions for developing countries that have a path to commercialization. We look to translate these high-level political commitments in climate change into action that catalyzes private sector investment. And I'd like to share with you more about our network, the impact we've had so far, and our impact model that sets us up to bridge that gap between the development priorities in countries and the investment needs to deliver a net zero future for all. But as you said, Rebecca, before I go into the slides, I just wanted to share a little bit about what's happening in the P4G Summit, literally happening in parallel to this event. So the first key point that has been alluded to, I think, is this big pivot, I think, that is emerging and trend of the decarbonization of heavy industry. And so Korea has announced that it's going to stop coal financing overseas. It's looking to trigger that, and of course, other potential overseas financiers in Japan and China. But I think the key part is to reallocate that capital into accelerating the energy transition we need with the industrial giants like Hanwha, Hyundai, SK Group as an example. And to not only do that domestically, but also globally, including sharing this technology and investment with developing countries. So that's a first takeaway that I'd say. The second one that has been mentioned is about the national pension system in Korea, the world's third largest pension fund, really looking to decarbonize. But what would be great to see as part of that decarbonization is an investment in a sort of blended finance institution with development financial institutions like Korean development bank into this green hydrogen supply chain network, which has been speaking about in Korea during this summit, and how we can use sort of an example. Jan mentioned the sort of offshore wind farm approach that Denmark has taken, but really blending in a whole new solution, for example, in green hydrogen, to bring these assets together with development financial institutions to developing countries. And that is my third point, that we really should see developing countries as a source of investment opportunity. So the challenge to you all and the opportunity is reallocate your capital, make these net zero asset managers initiatives come alive in our developing countries. And that's what we'd like to talk to you. So if we could go to the next slide, we can start to show an approach that we see how that global investment value chain coming together. In P4G, we ourselves are a partnership of 12 partner countries where Korea is a funder and host, of course, of the 2021 P4G Summit with our 5 partner organizations, including an ecosystem of over 140 business partners and 100 civil society partners. What we do in our partnerships are try to provide solutions in developing countries in 5 key areas: food, water, energy, cities, and the circular economy. And since our inception in 2018, we have started to develop a pipeline of more than 50 market-based partnerships, leveraging investment of over 290 million and scaling impact of 110,000 tons of annual CO2 emissions, and reducing that and also positively affecting 500,000 people on the ground. So P4G is the type of emerging initiative for investors to take notice on. How do we develop a pipeline of partnerships in that very, very early stage of upscale investments to crowd in investors like you with your commitments to green finance? So in the next slide, what we try and show is the approach to develop that pipeline. P4G believes investment is an effective way to deliver impact on the ground at the scale and speed required in this decade of action, as Rebecca has mentioned. We take an investing and impact approach where we mobilize investment in concrete partnerships working in developing countries. And what we do is we co-create right at the inception and implement these partnerships with country partners so that partnership goals are aligned with countries' national and economic priorities. Additionally, we align the partnership's ambitions with the agenda of global coalitions to deliver the impact and speed and scale required in coalitions like the Race to Zero coalition that Nigel Topping, as part of the COP Climate Champions, is talking about. So what we do in P4G is provide catalytic funding to partnerships that have clearly articulated a business model that has the potential to scale and replicate. This approach helps partnerships successfully launch their model while reducing and mitigating the risk in that really high risk for high impact development process. P4G works with our partnerships to prepare these models for investment readiness and match high-performing investment-ready partnerships with financial institutions to cultivate and unlock these investment opportunities. In this way, P4G bridges the gap between development and investment agendas to unlock these investment opportunities to deliver impact. Additionally, we look to elevate these partnerships at the global stage, as we are literally doing now at the P4G Summit, to really create an environment so that others can co-invest. What you then see in this last slide is how we see this global investment value chain happening from very humble beginnings of original concepts and how we move from the millions to the trillions, as Nigel said. So this market transformation approach we talk about, is about how do we scale solutions within this global investment value chain. And we start by looking at partnerships and providing catalytic startup and scale-up fundings at very modest amounts, but really with market-based solutions in the more of the millions. And what we look to do is blend that with finance from development financial institutions like Ifu and Torben Hus will be speaking in the second session, to really take that to scale that to the tens of millions that ultimately can get into the capital markets. And then from there into the hundreds of millions, and then hopefully the billions and the trillions. So what we would welcome is institutional investors like yourself to co-create and co-invest with us, as this is essential to create the scale and speed of partnerships required in this decade of action and bring this entire global investment value chain from the millions to the tens of millions, to the hundreds of millions, and then to the billions and trillions. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Ian. I think it's really valuable to just be reminded of that investment value chain and where some of those gaps and challenges are, and how groups like P4G are addressing those and helping to sort of to scale up. And we've heard a little bit from all the panelists now, and now we have an opportunity to dive into a few questions between us. And so we can dig into a few more of those areas that have been raised and really go a little bit deeper. We're going to sort of stay with this investment focus and perhaps just stay with you, Ian. You know, this critical investment and capital allocation piece is the most important, but we still need to scale it up. And this is where the role of governments and creating those enabling policies really comes in. But also thinking about something that Sandy mentioned, you know, we have to do this together, but there might be sort of slightly varying speeds between different investors and companies. But if we all do have to kind of move that together. And obviously something we've all been grappling with, and by virtue of this virtual session that we're having today, there's been a lot of talk about the sustainable recovery that's needed from COVID on the, you know, on the carbon intensive assets and infrastructure that we can't now invest in or create going forward, on the climate risk side, but also what do we need to do on the jobs and the social side to recover from this global pandemic, and how can we marry up the recovery from the pandemic and also address the climate crisis at the same time. So Ian, I'll just ask the first question back to you. Do you think it's possible to achieve these multiple objectives at the same time? And are there any sort of good examples that you could tell us about where you're seeing that happening?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, for that question. I'll give you two examples. One, which is very tangible, is in food loss and waste, where there's a very clear sustainable development goal for countries to halve their food loss and waste by 2030. What we have in this P4G partnership called Flawless is a situation where governments start to commit to targets for food loss and waste. Corporates voluntarily commit to those targets and to implement that. And what we are starting to see that this is independently measured in a system, but we're starting to see financial institutions like Rabobank start to develop these loan products called 12.3 SDG loans that really creates a financial product to take that operational savings, commoditize that into a financial product. And for us, that's starting to happen in the United Kingdom, but we're starting to bring this into our 3 partnership countries, Indonesia, Mexico, and South Africa. And while we're not there, because we're at the early stages, we really see turning that waste into an investable asset. And so that's a really strong example that if we structure this in a way that really becomes a standard methodology, the scaling potential for that is one that really should be able to be replicated over time, not only in developed economies, but in developing countries at the same time, bringing the costs down, but really unlocking the savings and assets. The second one that I think we're on the cusp of in the summit and with colleagues like all of our panel members is really the sort of decarbonization of shipping, but the decarbonization of shipping within the context of this creation of this green hydrogen network, shall I call it. So it's very clear. Jan, you know, in Denmark has companies like Maersk that said we want to commit to going net zero by 2050. And already by 2023, they'll have zero emissions shipping vessels. And Korea is one of the biggest shipping producers in the world, is also committed to this alliance called the Getting to Zero Coalition Partnership, which is a P4G partnership as well, to say, how do we create that zero emissions shipping together with people like in Netherlands, the Port of Rotterdam. I think the key in developing these networks is how do we ensure that trade and investment includes developing countries. Again, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa are part of this partnership. But how do we bring Korea's H2 Alliance? How do we bring Japanese technology investment? How do we bring the shipping and logistics chains from Denmark and prototypes like the offshore wind into this green hydrogen network? Create that network firstly, see what are those financial and business models that can be developed, but co-create that with developing countries at the same time. So we've got a template with food loss and waste of how we're starting to do that very tangibly. Can we do the same in green hydrogen with heavy industry and bring our heavy industry together?
Thanks so much, Ian. I just wanted to turn to Jon a bit, and you were talking about your targets and sort of some of your investment criteria. And you mentioned that you're looking to achieve, or you're planning to achieve some of these targets ahead of time. I'm really curious to hear about how you can do that and how you're looking to achieve that. And I think some others in the audience would be keen to hear that as well, as we're asking everyone to set targets and to achieve them. So if you're planning to achieve them early, it'd be great to get some of those insights from your side.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I know it sounds very simple, but it is actually, setting the targets and then working intensely on doing the investments. So that's what we do. But currently, some of the interesting thing is not only to do wind and solar investments like we do right now, it's also developing battery right next to, and also, of course, when Ian is talking about the so-called power to X. So when you have wind farms and solar panels farms, you have an issue that you sometimes have a surplus of energy. So when the wind is blowing, it's not always when you need the electricity. So you can use that surplus to make hydrogen, green hydrogen, or you can make it ammonia, which is what Maersk is going to use in their container ships. And I think that's a very, very important step in the decarbonization of the world, because now you can make green energy portable and you can store it, and then you can use it in ships or maybe also in airplanes and other industries. And so that's a very, very important step forward. And just like we did in Denmark in the beginning, where with the wind farms, we had the government help us a little bit by taking out some of the risk. I think when we have to build now the new power to X plants and, have to make them full scale, not only, just a small one, but in a full scale, it would be fantastic to have governments to support it. And I know that the Danish government is going to support it. And I think other countries should try to set up their own power to X setups, because it's really, really a transition, and it will make a lot more of investments for us as investors. And that's important. We have the money, we're ready. So we really want to do investments in power to X as well as wind and solar.
Great, thanks so much, Jon. A great insight into that and how you're seeing that from the European perspective. I'm keen to come back to Asia and come back to Sugano-san, and just ask you from your perspective, do you have any examples of investing in the transition where this is working well? Are there enough opportunities out there for you in the Asia markets or even in the Japanese market specifically at the moment?
So honestly speaking, at the moment, there is kind of scarcity of investment opportunities in Japan about transition technology opportunities, and so on. So all those Race to Zero started last October, I should say, when the Japanese government announced net zero by 2050. And after that, a flood of companies announced that their commitment to net zero. And ourselves and other Japanese asset managers joined the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. But still, there is only one asset owner which joined the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. So it's just started, and all those asset owners are complaining about the scarcity of investment opportunities here. But now, even though the asset under management in those category is still small compared to Europe or US, the increasing ratio, the ratio of the increased growth is quite high. So I think in 2 to 3 years' time, I think we will see a bunch of opportunities here in this transition investment and renewables and so on.
Thank you, Sugano-san. Sandy, I'm keen to get your perspective. You've got that global perspective. You mentioned some new ESG funds, and there's been a lot of, some comments, I know, last year about the inflows into some of your climate funds. So I'm keen to hear how BlackRock sees these opportunities, and especially in the Asia context.
Thank you. Yes, I think the global opportunity is really clear right now, both demand and supply. So to the extent that Asian investors want ESG-oriented products in their international allocations, that's quite easily done. I agree that we're still nascent in the local Asian product, but if we think about the global side, first of all, it's ESG tilt products, that those are now quite prolific. I mean, we have 200 of our ESG tilted index funds. We have a global renewable power fund that's just had a third launch. Really just a way that anyone can invest in renewable power. A new product, which I think is also a wave of the future, is our carbon transition readiness ETF, which is a product that essentially selects 4 companies that are more ready for the low carbon transition and selects away from those that are less so. So I think those opportunities are quite exciting. The new opportunity, and it's something we're working on right now, is to go into local Asian markets, Asian indices, and to replicate that. So we see that demand in China, we see that demand in Australia, and you will see from us announcements of essentially, whether it's ESG tilted products or other a low carbon transition readiness concept over time. That is our aspiration, so that we can enable investors to make those kinds of investments.
Fantastic. That's really exciting to hear that, and how you're approaching this for the Asia region. So looks like some exciting new investment vehicles and opportunities that aren't too far away. We're starting to get a few questions coming through from the YouTube channel. And so I'm keen to sort of pivot our focus back to kind of engaging with companies. Sugano-san, you mentioned before your approach to engaging with your portfolio companies, in Japan. And I'm keen to get your perspective on sort of the benefits of collaborative engagement from your perspective, how that works in Japan. I know you're a member of the Climate Action 100+ initiative, but yeah, how do you see engagement working, and what do you see, how do you see engagements in Asia? How are they going to evolve in the next few years?
Thank you, Rebecca. And I would like to focus on the Japanese engagement on the Japanese companies. And as I mentioned, the progress toward the net zero among Japanese companies have just started, and there are kind of handful of companies have a clear set of goals to net zero. So the first thing which as an asset manager we need to do is to encourage invested companies to set a goal of net zero. And for those companies that have already set such a goal, we will look at whether they are making compelling efforts to achieve that long-term goal through engagement. The PAII net zero framework, which I mentioned earlier, and Climate Action 100+, we are partner of that. Net zero company benchmark are useful tools for this purpose. We will then reflect it in proxy voting, when we think it is necessary, such as when a company's efforts are too slow and the company is kind of insular to the net zero movement. So that's our basic approach to the Japanese companies.
Thank you, Sugano-san. Sandy, I'll just come back to you on this front, on the engagement side of things. It was a very big week in the US with oil and gas last week. So keen to get some reflections from you on that and the Exxon situation, and then also what's your approach in Asia, or how do you see engagements in Asia? What are some of the lessons that could be learned from some of these international shareholder resolutions and votes in the Asia context?
Sure. So if we think about first the global context, I'd mentioned before there's 1,000 companies that we are engaging with globally around their climate plans and engaging and where necessary voting. We are actually quite heartened by significant progress that we're seeing. I mean, there are some really amazing examples. So take a US tech conglomerate that's actually now reduced its scope 1 and 2 by 90%. A Danish renewable energy company, 98% reduction in scope 1 and 2. There's even, a very large Asian steel company making really aggressive goals, even in spite of being, sort of ahead of its national contributions. So there is really tremendous energy. I think the biggest challenge is that making a true transition, not just setting a nice press release goal of net zero by 2050, but actually having that short-term, medium-term, long-term plan, tying to capital expenditure, that is a significant amount of work. And we have found companies, in this cycle where we have taken voting action because we feel that the companies are not yet making progress that we would like to see. In Q1, we did that at around 50 companies. So that was, our number of times that we took votes on climate. I mean, obviously there have been some high profile cases this week we put out vote bulletins. So if anyone's curious, they can go see it. I think the interesting difference is the role of shareholder proposals versus the role of voting in most Asian markets. So obviously in Europe and in the US, you have both the ability to hold directors accountable if you're not happy, because each director is up annually for an election. And often in the US in particular, there are shareholder proposals. In Asia, the context is quite different. Most Asian markets, you have a very strong role of state-owned or other private controlling shareholders. You often also have a phenomenon of triennial elections of directors. And so it makes engagement really, really, really important. And this is particularly true outside of Japan and Australia. And so what we're finding is that the most important transition that we'd like to see is for Asian companies to go beyond what we would call kind of a compliance mindset, must do the following because I am legally required, and to anticipate that there is significant transition risk in their businesses, that stranded asset risk that I talked about, and that they need to be anticipating that their regulatory environment may change, and it may actually change quite quickly. We've been really quite heartened by the South Korean dialogue in particular. And we were now at a point where many of the leading Korean companies are actually having annual meetings where they're sharing their plans with investors. They've become very open, and it's a very good two-way dialogue with investors. So that's been a really fantastic development. And I think we also see, incredible case examples, right? So South Korean utility company has just announced it'll no longer be doing, international investment in coal-fired utilities. That's a really, really important development in Korea, which is well known. I think what we're looking for is just to see expansion of that set of positive examples, and where engagement will be critical. Voting will be part of it, but again, it's just not the same tool as it might be in some of the other markets. And so that's why I completely agree the need to get in and get close to companies, and why we've made a big investment in stewardship in the region.
Great. Thanks so much, Sandy. And I believe we have a question from the in-person audience. So let's see if we can get that through. Just seeing if we're going to hear that come through, or that. If not, I've got another one that's come. Okay, great, thank you. It's just come through. So Jon, I might put this to you. What is the prevention method for greenwash? And I think this potentially ties in nicely with another question that someone asked about the policy and regulatory engagement and the importance of that. I'll let you combine those two together if you wouldn't mind.
Well, of course, greenwashing is something to be aware. I think from my perspective, the most important thing is to do, investments in real assets, and then there are no greenwashing. That's the easy way to do it, and that's the way that we do it. But I think also it's important that, like I stated before, that maybe I'll just we have a lot of governments trying to really change the world, and there's a lot of summits like this, and that's very, very important. But we really also need governments to propose and try to help us. And I believe that the best way that they can help us as investors and asset owners and asset managers is by taking out some of the risk in the investments. And then, of course, what we see in Europe right now with the disclosure agreement, where we have to disclose the taxonomy is going to arrive for us to use by start 2022. And I think that's just the beginning of a push that we will see within the EU. And I think that other markets will follow up with something similar. We already disclose now, we are already part of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance as well as the AIGCC. And I think that governments can actually try to make us even greener by getting us to disclose, having a common taxonomy, and then from there start to push and push and push, and then investments will happen, especially if they take some of the risk out of some of the investments in the beginning before the industry is matured. So like the wind industry is already matured and it can run by itself. We don't need any subsidies at all right now, but before we needed it, and now we need it in other technology areas.
Thank you so much, Jon. And I mean, I think we could just continue for another hour having this discussion amongst ourselves, and it's really fascinating. But in the interest of time and for the next panel, you know, we are going to have to wrap up this session. But and I know that the next panel will also delve more deeply into some of these areas and hopefully have a sort of further discussion on some of the regulatory developments and that the point around disclosure. And there's quite a lot of discussion around the mandatory disclosure of climate risks through the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We're starting to see that mandatory push come through from several governments in New Zealand. That's now been put into law, but also this discussion is coming through in the Asia context as well, which is really encouraging. So this session has really tried to cover sort of a couple of the areas that we focus on through the investor climate action plans. The need to scale up and accelerate the investment and increase capital allocation to the transition to net zero. You've heard about some of the net zero initiatives that you can aspire to reach when you're ready, and using this framework to help you get there. The importance of engaging with your portfolio companies and the opportunities that can present to your portfolios. And I think in the next session, we're about to hear more about that very important Korean leadership that we've started to hear a little bit about, and further Asian leadership, and how we can see more of that to really take advantage of this huge opportunity in this transition to net zero. So I'd like to thank my panelists very much, Sandy, Ian, Sugana-san, and Jon. Thank you so much for your time today and your insights. We'll finish up this panel now, and we'll hand over to the next panel. So thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for interesting presentations. Now, the first panel session has come to an end, and now we'll have a short 5-minute break. Please join the short break and come back to your seats in 5 minutes. And I would also like to thank you all for joining our session from Zoom and YouTube. Thank you. second panel session will start soon. Please come back to your seats. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We'll now continue to the second panel session. The session will be introduced by someone we already met, Mr. Nigel Topping, COP26 High-Level Climate Action Champion for UN Climate Talks. Let's watch Mr. Nigel Topping's video.
Hello again. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce this second session focused more specifically on the scaling up of green investment in Korea. It's widely acknowledged that COVID-19 recovery represented a massive opportunity for President Moon and his government to reboot previous attempts and commitments to accelerate the greening of Korea's economy and to become a leader in the emerging post-carbon world economy. After joining the Carbon Neutrality Coalition, we all welcomed President Moon's clear prioritization of a Green New Deal as part of Korea's recovery, followed by a clear commitment late last year to net zero by 2050 Korean economic trajectory. If you add to this the statement at the April Biden Climate Summit that Korea would no longer provide finance and export support to overseas coal projects, and would also look to enhance its 2030 NDC, we can see an emerging new policy environment signaling to Korea's world-leading companies that net zero is the new business as usual, and that the continuation of the old carbon-intensive model of growth would amount to big missed opportunities for one of Asia's most dynamic and promising economies. So we're aware in our work with leading Korean companies that the new horizon has arrived, with the chaebol conglomerates and other manufacturers all proactively seeking new partners internationally and regionally to take forward their bold decarbonisation plans. Companies like POSCO, Hanwha, Samsung, SK, Kogas and Hyundai. And some are looking at new green products and processes, others at whole new business lines that will put them at the cutting edge of the fast emerging green Asian economy. Now, driving these changes will require activation of what we call the ambition loop, where policy signals send a signal to private sector to adjust their plans and their targets, and where bold corporate action creates the political space for more ambitious and aggressive policy target setting. And on both sides of the equation, the ready and steady flow of finance from both government and private banks and investors will be critical, away from fossil fuel subsidies, coal projects and new carbon infrastructure, and reoriented towards the opportunities of the 21st century, including massive new offshore wind projects, electric and green hydrogen transport, high quality solar panels, green ammonia shipping, and zero emissions steelmaking. Just by itself, President Moon's plan for an 8 gigawatts offshore wind farm will require about $45 billion in investment, which explains clearly why he intends to rely on contributions from KEPCO, Hanwha, Doosan Heavy and others. It's with projects like this that Korea puts itself at the cutting edge of Asia's decarbonisation opportunity and at the front of the queue of countries that stand to benefit most. I very much welcome this discussion on how Korea can invest enthusiastically and take a leading role in the race to zero.
Thank you so much for the speech. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the session number 2 of the scaling up green investment opportunities. We'll just focus a little bit more on local and regional the investments regarding net zero. Connected to the session number 1 and today's topic and P4G. I would like to thank the AIGCC and Rebecca and Minju putting a lot of effort to organize this event and also investment agenda to host this timely the side event to discuss the very important topic. My name is Sung-woo Kim. I'm the head of Environment and Energy Research Institute at Kim & Jung, which is the biggest law firm in Korea. And it's very exciting and it's very great pleasure for me to moderate the session with these distinguished panelists. Let me just introduce the panelists one by one. Can you put all panelists? No, we do have some panelists from having joined in person. So let me just introduce one by one briefly. The left-hand side on myself, Mr. Yong-hyun Kim. He's the CEO of Hanwha Asset Management, one of the leading asset management, especially in the field of net zero and environment energy field. And the left-hand side of Mr. Kim is his Mr. Park Sung-hyun. He's the Chief Sustainability and Strategy Officer of Shinhan Financial Group. That's composed of the bank and asset management and the investment vehicles, and he's sort of in charge of all strategy. And Shinhan is one of the representative, the financial group in Korea. And we do have another distinguished panelists having joined online, as you can see from the screen. The bottom of the screen, from your perspective, we do have Torben Huss. He is CEO of IFU, which is, if I remember correctly, that's the investment fund for developing countries, I guess. And right upper corner, we have the Yasunori Iwanaga. I think he is the Chief Responsible Investment Officer from Amundi Asset Management. So we do have a little bit diverse sets of jurisdictions here, and we do have a lot, the outstanding panelists to discuss the topic today. As I just said, connecting from to connect the session number 1 smoothly, we'll just focus a little bit more on this region and especially Korean perspective, because the financial institutions in US, EU, they have the better system, I guess, and more mature and more experienced system. But we do have a little bit of some things to learn, a little bit more on net zero and learn each other. So my first, the question for all would be, I would like to ask what is your the institution's strategy on net zero? What you are doing on net zero, and what is your plan, and what you have done, and what is your role on this ESG the net zero and in ESG era. I would like to ask the question to Mr. Kim first, please.
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure and honor to be speaking to you today on this panel. As the first member from Korea to join AIGCC, it's particularly meaningful to be talking to you in support of AIGCC's ongoing activities, and in particular to be doing this in parallel with the P4G Global Summit being held here in Korea today. Let me give you a brief introduction about my company, Hana Asset Management, to give you a context of who we are, and then give you a brief overview of what we've been doing over the last few years. Hana Asset Management Company is a diversified asset management company. We manage about $100 billion of AUM across all asset classes, including equity, public equities, fixed income, ETFs, multi-asset solutions, as well as alternative investments, including real estate, infrastructure, private equity, and venture capital. We have overseas offices in New York, Singapore, China, and Vietnam, so we're doing this on a global level. And our clients are primarily institutional investors, as well as some retail. And in particular, also, we launched a local retail mobile digital application called Pine as our continuing efforts to increase our retail presence. So as an example of what we've been doing, and I think some of the other asset management companies here in Korea may be doing things on a similar pace or slightly slower pace or faster pace, but I think for the most part, I think it should be a good example of what is happening here in Korea. One of the first official activities for us started with the adoption of the Stewardship Code in August 2018. And it was at that time that we decided to build an ESG dedicated team that would help us think through what we needed to do to prepare for ESG. And I'll speak a little bit broadly in general terms about ESG, but obviously climate change, getting to net zero is probably in many ways the biggest part within ESG. And so as part of working with this team, we thought about our approach needing to be long-term sustainable. And so what we decided to do was we went about setting up an independent ESG rating system for ourselves. So Korea has 2 or 3 ESG rating companies, as well as the well-known global ESG rating and index providing companies that provide this service. And we do subscribe to their services, but we thought that over the long term, in order for us to be able to really find the correlation between ESG score and providing excess returns to our clients, that we had to have our own view on the ESG levels of the companies that we were investing in. And so a lot of the time in 2019 was spent in developing this system, primarily initially for the public equity division, which invests mostly in domestic equities. Once we had built that out towards the fall of 2019, we then went on to extend that to the fixed income division, and then towards the fall of 2020, we also extended ESG reviews for our alternative investment divisions. And so the alternative investments divisions work through reviewing individual products, individual investment opportunities, or investing in individual funds through an investment committee process. And every investment committee now has to have an ESG report, and the investment committee members spend time debating about the risks and opportunities that relate to ESG for that particular opportunity. And also, importantly, in September of 2020, we initiated our first formal engagement efforts. We focused those efforts on 3 particular areas, 2 of which were environment related. One was the requesting the adoption of TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and the other was relating to reducing packaging waste, mostly with respect to logistics companies. We believe that this type of engagement effort will increasingly be an important role that asset management companies will play as we continue to transition to net zero. Just to mention some of the other activities that we've done, as mentioned in January, we were the first Korean institution, January 2020, we were the first Korean institution to join AIGCC. In December 2020, we announced our support for TCFD. In January 2021, we, along with all of the other Hanwha Group financial affiliate companies, announced our pledge not to invest in coal. In April 2021, we signed the Stakeholder Capitalism Commitment Letter as part of the World Economic Forum measuring stakeholder capitalism work. And earlier this month in May, we established the ESG subcommittee within our board of directors. When we think about our ongoing and future role as asset management companies and what we will be doing to promote transition to net zero, I think it falls largely into two areas. One is the products that we'll be offering, and the other is engagement. In terms of ESG related funds, I think one needs to distinguish the passive strategies versus the active strategies. The passive strategies, whether they be in ETF form or kind of index funds, it'll be very important to be working with the ESG rating companies that we think are providing the most meaningful and sustainable strategies. And on the active ESG funds, we'll be using the ESG ratings provided by the global and local providers, but adding our own bottoms-up review and views on how ESG activities will ultimately relate to financial returns. And then on the alternate investment side, we have already committed to some social impact investing funds, and we are in the process of building our own internal impact funds. I think on the alternative investment side is where you can play an even more direct role by investing in specific projects that will have specific impact. And I think on the environment and climate-related front, this can be measured perhaps more accurately than it might be on social or governance side. And so those are some of the advantages that we think there is to providing kind of environment-related impact funds going forward. On the engagement front, I think you heard from some of the panelists on the prior panel about the importance of that engagement, and we fully agree and support such activities. I think there's a lot of different dialogues that need to be happening. There's a dialogue not only with the invested company, but really the dialogue with the customers, the asset owners, the investors, and then there are also dialogues with regulators. And all of those dialogues need to be going on in order to provide for kind of a consistent request and drive towards net zero that we can provide and help facilitate. I think this approach is going to be global whether we like it or not. The large Korean companies have shareholders like BlackRock and other institutions, global institutions, who are going to be demanding these things. Perhaps what asset management companies like ourselves here in Korea can do is work with some of the, as well as in addition to the large Korean companies, but also work with the mid-sized and smaller sized companies that perhaps don't make it into some of these ESG rating indices or aren't large enough to be on the engagement list for BlackRock or some other global institution. And it's through these combined efforts that we think that we can help facilitate getting to net zero faster. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's quite impressive that you moved a little bit earlier than your peers, I guess, like by formulating the team of ESG and having your own ESG rating system and like announcement of coal, non-investment in coal and announcement of stakeholder capitalism, etc. So can't really wait to listen to the second round of question of challenges and the solutions that you can share with your peers. Let's move on to the second speaker, Mr. Park. Let's just zoom out our view a little bit broad from asset management to entire financial group, which Mr. Park is in charge of. Can you just share the Shinhan strategy on net zero and ESG from broader perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I am Sung-hyun Park. I am the Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer of the Shinhan Financial Group. It is great honor to introduce you the green strategy of the Shinhan Finance Group. If you allow me to speak Korean, I will give you more precise and dynamic information of the climate finance in Korea. 안녕하십니까?
Hello, I am Sung-hyun Park from Shinhan Financial Group. Before the presentation, I'd like to tell you two numbers that I really want you to remember today. One is 728 million and the other is 0. The one on the left is the total greenhouse gas emissions that Korea currently emits, and on the right it is the total greenhouse gas emissions that Korea needs to emit in the future by 2050. So this is the future that we need to make together. So it is a future for 0 that everyone here has to create together. And the Shinhan's answer to that future is Zero Carbon Drive of Shinhan Financial Group. I will now be speaking about Shinhan Financial Group's Zero Carbon Drive. So this is the table of my contents. First, I'm going to be talking briefly about Zero Carbon Drive, and then Shinhan's direction and plan to achieve zero carbon. And finally, I will share with you the businesses of each group company that we currently are carrying out. As you are well aware, we must achieve net zero by 2050, that is reaching zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. To this end, Shinhan Financial Group, as a leading financial company in Korea, has designed the Zero Carbon Drive strategy based on two major directions to reduce carbon emissions and expand eco-friendly financing. Shinhan Financial Group's asset portfolio carbon emissions will be reduced by 38.6% by 2030 and 69.6% by 2040 and reach net zero by 2050. The goals have been set by utilizing SBTi's sector-specific decarbonization approach to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement 2 degrees Celsius scenario. In addition, in the case of eco-friendly finance, a total of 30 trillion won in loans investments will be established by 2030. These endeavors will be led through three methods. First of all, we need to measure. We need to have accurate measurement, and For the additional carbon that is being generated due to the loans and investments that we make, we really need to evaluate this, and we need to have proper management. For the measurement, it is calculated based on corporate data released by the Ministry of Environment, which is open data, and we only have data up to 2019. According to 2019 results, the carbon emissions related to Shinhan Financial Group is 12 million tons. And going forward, we plan to expand the measurement scope based on the measurement method by asset classification presented by PCAF. So we are trying to make the measurement more sophisticated. And next, on the loan investment evaluation, we utilize the equator principles. We abide by the principle of not providing financial support if there are factors such as environmental destruction and human rights violations. And we are doing quarterly asset portfolio emissions monitoring. This is the management side, and we plan to integrate and utilize such factors into our group risk management monitoring factor. Next, I want to talk about the two directions in management. First, we are looking at the carbon emissions of high carbon emission companies. As the emissions of the top 50 companies account for 83% of the total, we plan to monitor eco-friendly strategies and plans of these top 50 companies for their loans and investments and decisions. We will have engagement activities with these top 50 companies. And the second important indicator is the carbon intensity indicator. So for the top 10 and top 50 companies, they have 10 to 15 times higher carbon intensity indicators. So in the case of loan and investment decisions, we will be utilizing such carbon intensity indicators. However, as we all know, just by breathing, we emit carbon. So just by reducing it, we cannot achieve carbon neutrality. Shinhan is analyzing areas where eco-friendly finance can be expanded to discover carbon offsetting elements. We plan to expand financial support for natural resource technology and renewable energy, such as solar energy and wind energy. This page focuses on the offsetting scenarios and renewable energy business and technology based on the scale of renewable energy investment. Lastly, let me tell you about what we are pushing for in our major group companies. Shinhan Bank is expanding its ESG evaluation-based financial products, and for the financial investment, it provides ESG consensus to analyze and compare ESG evaluation indicators of the companies being invested. And for the asset management, we are benchmarking BlackRock. We are expanding and disclosing of ESG information about the companies that we are investing in. Since the declaration of Zero Carbon Drive Declaration, all group companies are working for the transition of to a low carbon economy. As such, Shinhan's Zero Carbon Drive is not just a declaration, it is the commitment of finance to on measured targets for the environment. As Peter Drucker said, what cannot be measured cannot be managed. Shinhan will play a role in carbon neutrality by accurately measuring and managing the amount of the emissions due to its financial assets. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Park. I think it's quite interesting to learn that how you calculate or measure financed emissions. Although there are no sort of standardized method, you developing your own method to calculate the financed emission. I think I'm pretty sure that experience will give a lot of lessons for other financial institutions in Korea and other region. And also, you have focused 50,
Yes.
the main companies.
Yes.
Like, it's like a Korean style, the climate action 50. instead of Climate Action 100 plus. So we'll just get back to that when I ask a second question on the challenges and solutions that you can share with the peers.
Yes.
Now let's move on to Mr. Huss, Torben Huss, who is CEO of IFU. As I said, that's Investment Fund for Developing Countries. We would like to hear from developing countries' perspective. On Saturday, I met President Moon at the lunch event of the Net Zero Committee, and he focused a lot on green overseas development assistance from Korea. So I'm pretty much exciting to hear from your view on net zero investment scale up from developing countries' perspective. Over to you. Sorry, I can't hear you. Did you mute your mic, or can you unmute your mic, or? No, I still can't hear you. Do we have a technical problem back there, or? It seems that he's not unmuting, so I think it's a problem of our side. If this continues, we can move on to the Amundi first, and then get back to him, if that's a problem. Can you try one more time, Mr. Huss? And if not, no, we can't. Sorry, we can't still hear you. So may I just, Mr. Huss, may I just move on to the Amundi, the Chief Responsible Investment Officer of Amundi, and get back to you while our team will fix the problem. All right. Sorry, Mr. Iwagana.
Yes.
Oh, thank God. We can hear you. Please,
right.
Please, let's just focus on Asian investors' perspective on net zero. So what you have done on net zero strategy and ESG strategy, and what is your plan for that, so that we can share that lessons and experiences, please.
Right. Okay. First off, it's very sort of an honor to be here, and my name is Yas Iwanaga. I'm a CRO Asia at Amundi, and so let me give you sort of kind of our undertakings in the regions. Well, some are sort of specifically focusing on this region, but some are really for global in nature. In terms of our strategy as Amundi in the net zero space, it is somehow sort of similar to what the other speakers have delivered. And in particular, in Korea, we have this entity called NH Amundi, whose sort of SRI AUM is now exceeded 2 trillion won. And it's got a long history of SRI, by the way, and since 2006, when it sort of first launched the SRI fund. And in the recent past, it's been very active in the multiple space, including the recent launch. Oh.
Sorry, go on. They are fixing their problem.
Oh, sure. Okay. Including the recent launch of an equity fund called the Green Korea Fund, and we've seen sort of a good traction, gathering roughly $250 million US. And in terms of the our sort of initiatives in this region, I would like to mention one thing, which is creating a framework of green investing. And as you know, we've seen the nice growth, healthy growth of green bond market, but it's too small. And what we have done with in partnership with AIIB is to come up with a broader framework such that we allocate more of capitals or more of investment into not only green bonds but also issuers with a good green profile. And so we sort of developed sort of 3 dimensions to evaluate issuers and which is about the transition risk aspect as well as fiscal risk aspects. And the third one is, of course, what they are doing to contribute to transition. So by applying a framework, we believe that we, the investors or asset owners, can think about the investing into what the companies who have already achieved sort of better performance in 3 dimensions, which we call the A-listed firms. But also we can sort of open up the investment opportunities who are on the track or who are on the sort of trend of improving their sort of businesses or performance. And so by so doing, we believe that we really evaluate issuers' green risk profile, if I may, and to understand the what they are really doing and how they sort of proceed with reduction of carbon emissions by referring to, for example, SBT and others. And so the point we like to make here is that we are here to create or bring in these sort of innovations by help nurture the development of the market, transition finance and whatsoever, in addition to all those standard activities like proxy voting and engagement. By the way, Amundi has a sort of multiple tools to engage companies. It's not just only sort of one-on-one meetings, but we sort of try strategically use the collective engagement. And in the recent past, we've seen sort of good progress in helping the financial companies to change their carbon strategies to abolish their new financing into coal-fired generation plants and whatsoever. So net-net, we are very sort of active by creating or bringing in the solutions or innovations for asset owners or investors, and also continue engaging the issuers companies. That's it from me.
Thank you so much. It's quite impressive that you have that helping to scale up the Asian market through the AIIB Amundi, the framework. That's one impressive point, and another one is engagement tool that you just mentioned, that to have strategic the conversation collectively. So hopefully we can get back to you at the second round of questions to touch a little bit more on that. Now let's get back to the CEO of IFU. Hopefully this time the technical problem doesn't just bother us. Mr. Huss?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's working perfect.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate, and good evening, everyone. My name is Torben Huss. I'm CEO of IFU, which is a Danish development finance institution owned by the Danish government. We invest in emerging markets on a commercial basis, provide equity and loans. We have more than 50 years of experience investing in emerging markets. Climate investments has been a part of our investment strategy for many years. And in order to accelerate investments in this field, we back in 2014 established the Danish Climate Investment Fund, which is a blended financing instrument where IFU, the Danish government, has invested 40% and Danish institutional investors have invested 60% of the capital in that fund. And that was established back in 2014 and is fully invested now, and has now been followed by a Sustainable Development Goals Fund of more than $800 million along the same lines, with 40% of the capital from the Danish government and 60% from institutional investors. And IFU administrates these funds apart from investing our own capital from the Danish government. And these instruments we see as very important to unlock investments from institutional investors into emerging markets, into investments which they otherwise perceive as very high risk investments due to the lack of adequate political framework conditions in many countries. Therefore, by investing together with a government entity with a long track record and experience in investing in emerging markets, this has been a way to, let's say, catalyze investments from institutional investors in order for them to be more acquainted with the risk and opportunities in this field. I think that would be the words from my side now, and then in the second part we could maybe go into what is our experience been and what do we see as the barriers and problems.
Thank you so much, Mr. Huss. That IFU reminds me of my experience having advised Green Climate Fund since 2013. You know, the fund has a similar mandate that it's supposed to help developing countries to comply with the climate change adaptation and mitigation with many countries contributions. And the risk mitigation is the really key for other investors can join to the projects and to the investment. So it's to redirect the flow of cash into this climate change field. Well, with that, I think we just briefly learned what are the strategies of entities that you belong to. And based on that, I would like to ask the second question with a little bit different sequence. I will just start from Mr. Iwanaga. And the question is, what are the challenges towards the net zero, like, you know, mobilization, engagement, and any advice for other institutions? Because you have your global perspective and Asian perspective. So we would like to hear lots of experience and lessons and takeaways from your experience on net zero strategy and ESG strategy. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, a couple of things, that have come to my mind. First off, the disclosure, and prior speakers, have mentioned, we have still lots of room to improve level of disclosures in terms of standardizations or enabling the comparability. And yes, we are really sort of big about the trying to develop these solutions to finance green transition whatsoever. But to make it happen, we would like us to sort of see more about transparency on the side of issuers. And it's a sort of a combination of engaging those issuers as well as trying to seek the policy setters or regulators so that they're on the same track as ours. That's one thing. The other thing is, asset owners. As an asset manager, yes, we can offer the kind of options or products or strategies in light of their sort of investment objectives. But if the asset owner, doesn't have a good enough values toward sort of energy transition whatsoever, we could only do so much. So again, engagement with the asset owners will be sort of another key for us to really speed up this momentum. That's it for me.
Thank you so much. Policy alignment and engagement with the asset owner, it's really the great points that we should to keep in mind. Let's move on to the Mr. Huss. Do you have any the challenges and the solutions or any advice for the investors who will maybe declare net zero among Korean institutions? There are lots of institutions are preparing for the net zero commitment and ESG strategy and looking for the investment opportunities in developing countries in the area of climate change. Do you have any some advice for them? Do your challenges, including your challenges and solutions?
Thank you. I think my perspective, of course, is mainly on emerging markets. And I think really the main challenge for us is the lack of bankable projects to invest in. The need is there, the capital is there, but we desperately need in many countries and regions more bankable investment projects. And we know that the market, the commercial conditions are there, the pricing is right. It's a matter of a requirement for more investments in project development, and also working with local governments to further improve the local framework conditions in many countries, the legal framework around investing in renewable energy, in order to have a larger flow of investments into this asset class. Initiatives like the P4G are of course very important in this respect, I believe, because they go in early on and take risk and encourage investments in project development, while at the same time promoting engagement in dialogue with policymakers to ensure that the right framework conditions are in place. So I think really that is a core of the challenge, that is to ensure that we can mitigate some of the risks associated with investing in renewable energy in emerging markets, and thereby attract more investments both in project development and project implementation.
Thank you, Mr. Huss. I think there are tremendous opportunities from emerging countries if the public sector can alleviate a little bit of the risk so that the private investor can jump into. Let's move on to the Korean leaders, having joined in person here. Before I ask this question, I think we all have to understand that the Korean, not only financial institutions, for Korean companies, I think it's really hard to ignore short-term profit or short-term performance for the sake of long-term benefit. I think that's the key. It's really hard to manage or balance between the short-term cost and long-term benefit. So I think the panelists here, I think have moved a little bit earlier than other institutions, will hopefully give us their experience for us to take away. I'll just start from Mr. Kim from Hanwha.
I think the challenges that we face are similar, but perhaps at different stages. I think Korea has been slower in terms of committing to getting to net zero by 2050, but it has committed to it. But now there still is the problem that there needs to be a roadmap to get to it, and that hasn't been fully prepared yet. And so there's both kind of confusion in the market as well as an interest and a desire to engage in getting to zero. And so how do we try to help in that process? I think governments, regulators, companies all have different roles to play. But as asset management companies, at least the way I think about it is, our role is really to help pave the way to getting to net zero while also finding ways and providing investment opportunities that also create a financial return. Because I think if we are not able to provide that financial return over the long term, that it's not going to be as sustainable. And so as we think about that, we face a lot of different issues. And I think it's a little different between whether it's a public market investment opportunity or a private market investment opportunity. You know, if you go into a private equity fund or a venture fund that has a specific climate strategy, it's not going to be marked to value, marked to market for 5-10 years. There's a longer time period you have in trying to affect the climate impact that you want to get to, and then to provide those returns. I think the public markets offer a little bit more of a challenge in that you're seeing the financial return results on a quarterly, annual basis. So how do you deal with the difference between the 2 to 3 year goal versus the 10-year goal? And are the asset owners who are providing these funds really willing to wait 10, 20 years for these returns? And if something is not going to provide that ESG or climate impact, is there some other value that you can attribute to it so that you can get there? Also, how do you provide the incentive to a board of directors of a company and a CEO? Particularly, CEOs in Korea typically tend to have not as long tenures. And so how do you provide the incentive to a short tenured CEO to embark on long-term strategies? And so these are kind of just some of the examples that I think really needs to be resolved by continued engagement and dialogue. As some of the other panelists have already mentioned, it's a dialogue with invested companies, but it's just as important to have that dialogue with the asset owners, retail investors, regulators, governments, et cetera. And we'll get to that consensus, but I think a lot more dialogue needs to happen for us to get there.
Thank you so much. Mr. Park?
Yes, thank you. 제가 볼 때는 크게 한 세 가지.
I think there are 3 difficulties and challenges. First, it was mentioned by other panelists, but is that we do not have enough information relating to the environment. In Korea, all we have is the official data released by the Ministry of Environment. For other data, we have to make estimations based on the results of consulting companies, and therefore we would like to see some more official data on the carbon, for example, emissions. And the second, climate-related information. We don't have tools to analyze the climate-related information. For example, when there is a for example, climate event that takes place, we do not have the tools to assess a corporate's credit or risks associated with that, and there are some gaps here compared to other countries. And third, this is another important area. It is about human resources. We have been in the financial sector, so we do not have many people that have expertise in the environment who also have experience in the financial sector. So it is important for us to have human resources that have expertise into climate and ESG.
Well, time flies. It's almost 50 minutes, so I'm just keep pushing by the host that we have to finalize the session. But I do just have one final question from the floor, so I'll just take that question before I just conclude the session. The question is the ESG evaluation system, should it be sort of a little bit different for asset management companies? The question to Mr. Kim, can you just elaborate?
Yeah.
Address that?
I think the ESG rating system, the framework itself is not different. We use the same framework that the ESG rating companies use for the most part. We use them as benchmarks in establishing our own system as well. What I think some of the difference is that, one, we are less focused on an aggregate score. It doesn't matter what the actual overall score is. We're trying to figure out what are some of the important ESG-related activities that are meaningful, that we think is meaningful for this company, whether that relates to climate, whether that relates to social, or whatever it is. What is that? How meaningful is it? And what type of impact do we think will that have on the company's future prospects, and then ultimately, I guess, the company's future stock price? And so we look at from that perspective and focus less on the aggregate score. And then we try to make it so that it's more timely. It's not necessarily all based on historical information. It's not as much based on historical information, but again, this has to be useful for our portfolio managers who are making investment decisions to their portfolios that it's going to be in place for the next 2-3 years. So we try to make it so that it's timely and forward-looking.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think I have to conclude the session with a bit of just one sentence, if I may. There must be a challenge between to balance between the short-term cost and long-term benefit. That those challenges should be addressed by alliance and engagement for sustainable competitiveness and opportunity. With that, I would like to just close the session. Please thank Mr. Hurst and Iwanaga having joined online, and Mr. Kim and Mr. Park having joined in person. Please give a big applause for them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And sorry for the problems.
Thank you very much for interesting presentations. The second panel session has come to an end. Now we'll have the last networking session for you to exchange opinions and talk to each other freely, sitting at different tables. We have time till 5:40 p.m., and so please do not hesitate to get up and start a conversation during the networking session. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we now will wrap up the AIGCC C-level investor event, Global Investor Action and Initiatives Towards Net Zero at P4G Global Summit. I would like to thank all speakers and participants once more for joining us today. I hope that through this event, we gain better understanding on the global trends on climate change and share the best practices for the future. Thank you. 안녕하세요. 네, AIGCC 정책 애널리스트 김민주입니다. 오늘 세션에 참가해 주셔서 정말 감사드립니다. 네, 참가하신 여러분.
Thank you very much. We're now going to have a networking session, so please use this time to your advantage. And again, thank you so much for participating in our program today. This has been Kim Min-ju of AIGCC. Thank you.